At the virtual 19th Extraordinary Summit of the East African Community Heads of State, Chairperson Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta made the announcement following the recommendations of the East African Council of Ministers.
Today, the 29th of March 2022, therefore marks another historic day for the East African community as we admit an additional member to our growing community.
The GDP of the region has now grown from $193 billion to $240 billion. The DRC will have the advantage of access to the ports of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. The East African heads of state described Tuesday's event as historic.
The joining of the East African community by DRC is a big event.
I urge all organs and institutions of the community to accelerate the full integration of DRC into organization in keeping with the roadmap approved by the Council of Ministers.
It is my optimism then the DRC will ratify the Treaty of Accession within a specified time to allow its citizens full integration into the community.
Not lost on the leaders are the issues of insecurity in the country.
We now need to work on the issue of peace in Eastern Congo because that area has been disturbed for a long time.
The DRC now has until the 14th of next month to ratify its admission. Sarah Kimani, SABC News, Kenya.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Zambian Economist Yusuf Dadio. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program. Always good to have you.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be with you.
All right, Yusuf, it's quite interesting for us to hear the word East African community, and yet you've got a country joining on the other side of the continent.
That's quite an interesting development. Of course, as you are aware, the history of the East African community was basically Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. But of course, these three countries also have neighbors. And clearly, the neighbors to these three countries decided that they wanted to be part of this economic trade bloc called the East African community. So I guess, like many things, it grows. And of course, the East African community is now growing towards the central part of Africa, because when you look at the continent, the subcontinent, all the countries that are bordering with these three countries are inland, going towards the center of the continent, and some of them may be spanning to the Atlantic Ocean.
All right, so again, I start to worry about some of these groupings that overlap. I'm thinking about COMESA, for example. What does this all mean? We've got this Continental Free Trade Area Agreement now. Shouldn't we be working ourselves out of all these groupings that in part are unique, and then some of them overlap with other countries? Where do we stop and start when we're getting this complex maze of groupings?
Well, I think we need to see the context in which these groupings are set up. As you correctly say, Zambia, for example, we started off with the Southern African Development Community, which is referred to as SADC. And the SADC Free Trade Area was really trying to get the 12 Southern African countries to work together. And when they did that, it means that these are countries that had some relationship with each other in respect to common trade, common foundations. And so the East African community had a similar arrangement where also within East Africa there were some linkages amongst the 3 or 4 countries. And so it's these common linkages that these free trade area agreements work on. And as they work on these common linkages, they begin to realize that they can expand their footprint. And you're quite rightly saying that from the Southern African Development Community, Zambia expanded into the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, which is COMESA, with over 20 countries on board. And now with the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, we are looking at 50 to 60 countries, 50 to 55 countries on board. And that's something that I think is an attempt to begin to get the continent of Africa to work together, starting off with smaller groupings that feel that there's some kind of bond amongst them, and then stretching out as they gain more confidence into expanding into the entire continent.
All right, so let's try and unpack this new marriage. What's in it for the DRC to be a member of the East African Community?
Well, the DRC, as we all know, has a population of about 90 million people, which is pretty big. The DRC is a country that is surrounded by much smaller countries, including Zambia. And for the DRC, it's really a question of how much additional trade they can get out of this relationship under the East African Community. But I think we also need to be quite aware that some of these regional groupings have not worked as well as we hoped they would. One that comes to mind is the Southern African Customs Union, SACU, which is South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Swaziland, and Botswana. And we found that over the 100 years that SACU has been in place, some of the smaller countries ended up becoming markets for South Africa, and South Africa was like the big brother in the grouping, and South Africa benefited from it. So in the East African Community, with DRC joining it, I think DRC's got to have a plan for how they intend to take advantage of the relationship with the other 6 countries. And if they don't do this, then they will find that at the end of the day, they just become a market for the other member states to offload their products into the Congo, which is a huge market.
When we compare with a grouping like ECOWAS, where people are free to move from country to country, what's the arrangement with the East African Community? Because, when you suddenly add 90 million people, that's quite a thing.
Yes, it's and I think this is really the threat to the community. Back in the day when it was the 3 East African countries, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, there were no restrictions of people moving across from one country to another. But with the Congo, I think the Congo, really, the population of the Congo is equivalent to all the other 6 member states put together. And there's likely to be a huge transition of Congolese people moving into the East African Community in search of jobs, in search of opportunities, which might undermine the trade arrangement which they've been trying to set up. So this is something that has to be looked at very carefully. I guess there's going to be some kind of exclusion rules and exception rules to avoid a migration of people from one region to another. I think this is something they have to sit down and think about very carefully. With Africa, we saw that under the Cotonou Agreement with the European Union, when the trade was allowed, but the movement of people from Africa into Europe, that was restricted, that was controlled to avoid a similar type of challenge from happening. So I guess this is something that the East African community needs to think very carefully about.
So what does it mean for neighboring states outside of the EAC that belong to COMESA like Zambia?
Well, the good thing is that all these regional blocs are beginning to merge. Zambia is a member of SADC, is a member of COMESA, and is a member of the Continental Free Trade Area. So to a large extent, Zambia has a relationship with the Congo. We might not be a member of the East African Community, but we're both members of COMESA and both members of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So I guess there is a kind of special protocols for each regional grouping to be able to promote certain types of trade, certain types of interactions. And this is going to be a bit of a complex thing to resolve, because there's going to be a lot of overlaps, and it may lead to trade conflicts, which is something that the various communities need to speak together about, and maybe under the umbrella of the African Union, to be able to avoid conflicts, to be able to avoid tariff barriers and trade barriers, which might come out of these sub-regional groupings.
Just before we started speaking, we played that story, and I think President Museveni gave us a clue of a really big issue, and that's the peace and security that is the DRC. Now, when I think again of ECOWAS and I think of SADC, there are peace and security protocols that kick in the region. Is there one for the East African community, and in which case are they inheriting a headache?
Well, they say nothing ventured, nothing gained. Everything we do in life carries a certain level of risk. And I think with people like, leadership like President Yoweri Museveni and President Paul Kagame, I think we do have some hard-hitting leaders out there that will be able to highlight the peace and security challenges and find ways on how they can harmonize these. But beyond that, there's also legal jurisdictions. In the Southern African Development Community, we more or less had countries coming from the same British legal system working together, whereas the East African Community will have a mixture. You look at the three East African countries, they all come from a British background, and then their neighbors tend to be more from a French or Belgian background, and I'm not quite sure how the legal system in these other countries works, and that's something they're going to have to look at to harmonize. But the thing with regional groupings is you can choose what you want to harmonize and leave some things to be dealt with in the medium term and in the long term. Not everything has to be resolved at once. It takes time, it takes a certain amount of experience to have been had, and after that, what you have is a situation where with time you begin to get a more harmonized arrangement, because this is all about taking care of all the member states' interests, and that's not so easy, but you can do it a step at a time over time.
All right. So now the thing about this kind of grouping is that the whole is supposed to be greater than the sum of its parts. Is this what we're likely to see in your view?
Absolutely. That's the goal. But of course, it's easier said than done, because most of the countries in Africa are going through developmental challenges and political challenges. So depending on how one member state decides to hold its elections, whether it decides to hold its elections or not, is going to impact on the well-being of the whole. So there is a certain amount of peer pressure that needs to be put in place, a certain amount of mentoring that has to be put in place for the communities to operate in a very progressive way. I mean, if we look at the European Union, for example, we saw the challenges that are there. The British pulled out of it. They don't have a common monetary union. Some members decided to go with the euro. Others decided not to go with the euro and keep their own currencies. So these are the kinds of things that have to be considered and dealt with basically a step at a time. It's an uphill battle, given that Africa tends to have a lot more political challenges than countries in Europe. But I do believe with time and with commitment and resilience, African countries will get it right.
Conversation on. Let's be optimistic and let's see what happens. And it could be a blueprint for other things in other regions, but sounds great on paper. Let's see if they can work it out. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Zikomo kwambiri.
Zikomo. Mwende bwino.
Thank you. All right, that's Zambian economist Yusuf Dadio speaking to us about this inclusion in the East African community by the DRC. Exciting times indeed, and that's something we'll definitely be watching.